Briar Rose by the Brothers Grimm, narrated by Cheryl Bassett. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen who had no children, and this they lamented very much. But one day, as the queen was walking by the side of the river, a little fish lifted its head out of the water and said, "Your wish shall be fulfilled, and you shall soon have a daughter." What the little fish had foretold soon came to pass, and the queen had a little girl who was so very beautiful that the king could not cease looking on her for joy, and determined to hold a great feast. So he invited not only his relations, friends, and neighbours, but also all the fairies, that they might be kind and good to his little daughter. Now there were 13 fairies in his kingdom, and he only had 12 golden dishes for them to eat out of, so that he was obliged to leave one of the fairies without an invitation. The rest came, and after the feast was over, they gave all their best gifts to the little princess. One gave her virtue, another beauty, another riches, and so on, until she had all that was excellent in the world. When 11 had done blessing her, the 13th, who had not been invited and was very angry on that account, came in and determined to take her revenge. So she cried out, "The king's daughter shall in her 15th year be wounded by a spindle and fall down dead." Then the 12th, who had not yet given her gift, came forward and said that the bad wish must be fulfilled, but that she could soften it, and that the king's daughter should not die, but fall asleep for 100 years. But the king hoped to save his dear child from the threatened evil, and ordered that all the spindles in the kingdom should be bought up and destroyed. All the fairies' gifts were in the meantime fulfilled, for the princess was so beautiful and well-behaved and amiable and wise that everyone who knew her loved her. Now it happened that on the very day she was 15 years old, the king and queen were not at home, and she was left alone in the palace. So she roamed about by herself and looked at all the rooms and chambers, till at last she came to an old tower, to which there was a narrow staircase ending with a little door. In the door there was a golden key, and when she turned it, the door sprang open, and there sat an old lady spinning away very busily. "Why, how now, good mother," said the princess, "what are you doing there?" "Spinning," said the old lady, and nodded her head. "How prettily that little thing turns round," said the princess, and took the spindle and began to spin. But scarcely had she touched it before the prophecy was fulfilled, and she fell down lifeless on the ground. However, she was not dead, but had only fallen into a deep sleep, and the king and the queen, who just then came home, and all their court fell asleep too, and the horses slept in the stables, and the dogs in the yard, and the pigeons on the housetop, and the flies on the walls. Even the fire on the hearth left off blazing and went to sleep, and the meat that was roasting stood still, and the cook, who was at that moment pulling the kitchen boy by the hair to give him a box on the ear for something he had done amiss, let him go, and both fell asleep. And so everything stood still and slept soundly. A high hedge of thorns grew round the palace, and every year it became higher and thicker, till at last the whole palace was surrounded and hidden, so that not even the roof or the chimneys could be seen. But there went a report through all the land of the beautiful, sleeping Briar Rose, for thus was the king's daughter called, so that from time to time several kings' sons came and tried to break through the thicket into the palace. This they could never do, for the thorns and bushes laid hold of them as it were with hands, and there they stuck fast and died miserably. After many, many years there came another king's son into that land, and an old man told him the story of the thicket of thorns, and how a beautiful palace stood behind it, in which was a wondrous princess called Briar asleep with all her court. He told, too, how he had heard from his grandfather that many, many princes had come, and had tried to break through the thicket, but had stuck fast and died. Then the young prince said, "All this shall not frighten me. I will go and see Briar. The old man tried to dissuade him, but he persisted in going. Now that very day 100 years were completed, and as the prince came to the thicket he saw nothing but beautiful flowering shrubs through which he passed with ease, and they closed after him as firm as ever. Then he came at last to the palace, and there in the yard lay the dogs asleep, and the horses in the stables, and on the roof sat the pigeons fast asleep with their heads under their wings. And when he came into the palace, the flies slept on the walls, and the cook in the kitchen, and still holding up her hand as if she would beat the boy, and the maid sat with a black fowl in her hand ready to be plucked. Then he went on still further, and all was so still that he could hear every breath he drew, till at last he came to the old tower and opened the door of the little room in which Briar was, and there she lay fast asleep, and looked so beautiful that he could not take his eyes off, and he stooped down and gave her a kiss. But the moment he kissed her, she opened her eyes and awoke, and smiled upon him. Then they went out together, and presently the king and queen also awoke, and all the court, and they gazed on each other with great wonder. And the horses got up and shook themselves, and the dogs jumped about and barked. The pigeons took their heads from under their wings and looked about and flew into the fields. The flies on the walls buzzed away. The fire in the kitchen blazed up and cooked the dinner, and the roast meat turned round again. The cook gave the boy the box on his ear so that he cried out, and the maid went on plucking the fowl. And then was the wedding of the prince and Briar celebrated, and they lived happily together all their lives. Brothers Grimm. The brothers Grimm, Die Brüder Grimm or Die Gebrüder Grimm, Jacob 1785 to 1863, and Wilhelm Grimm 1786 to 1859, were German academics, philologists, cultural researchers, lexicographers, and authors who together collected and published folklore during the 19th century. They were among the best-known storytellers of folk tales and popularized stories such as Cinderella, The Frog Prince, The Goose Girl, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, Rumpelstiltskin, Sleeping Beauty, and Snow White. Their first collection of folk tales, Children's and Household Tales, was published in 1812. The brothers spent their formative years in the German town of Hanau. Their father's death in 1796 impoverished the family and affected the brothers for many years after. They attended the University of Marburg, where they developed a curiosity about German folklore, which grew into a lifelong dedication to collecting German folk tales. The rise of Romanticism during the 19th century revived interest in traditional folk stories, which to the brothers represented a pure form of national literature and culture. With the goal of researching a scholarly treatise on folk tales, they established a methodology for collecting and recording folk stories that became the basis for folklore studies. Between 1812 and 1857, their first collection was revised and republished many times, growing from 86 stories to more than 200. In addition to writing and modifying folk tales, the brothers wrote collections of well-respected German and Scandinavian mythologies, and in 1838 they began writing a definitive German dictionary, Deutsches Wörterbuch, which they were unable to finish during their lifetimes. Many of the Grimm's folk tales have enjoyed enduring popularity. The tales are available in more than 100 languages and have been adapted by filmmakers including Lotte Reiniger and Walt Disney, with films such as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Sleeping Beauty. During the 1930s and 40s, the tales were used as propaganda by the Third Reich. Later, in the 20th century, psychologists such as Bruno Bettelheim reaffirmed the value of the work, in spite of the cruelty and violence in original versions of some of the tales, which the Grimms eventually sanitized. Writing. From 1807 onward, the brothers added to the collection. Jacob established the framework, maintained through many iterations, from 1815 until his death. Wilhelm assumed sole responsibility for editing and rewriting the tales. He made the tales stylistically similar, added dialogue, removed pieces that might detract from a rustic tone, improved the plots, and incorporated psychological motifs. Ronald Murphy writes in The Owl, the Raven, and the Dove that the brothers, and in particular Wilhelm, also added religious and spiritual motifs to the tales. He believes that Wilhelm gleaned bits from the old Germanic faiths, Norse mythology, Roman and Greek mythology, and biblical stories that he reshaped. Over the years, Wilhelm worked extensively on the prose, expanded and added detail to the stories to the point that many grew to be twice the length of those in the earliest published editions. In the later editions, Wilhelm polished the language to make it more enticing to a bourgeois audience, eliminated sexual elements, and added Christian elements. After 1819, he began writing for children. Children were not initially considered the primary audience. Adding entirely new tales or adding new elements to existing tales, elements that were often strongly didactic. Some changes were made in light of unfavourable reviews, particularly from those who objected not all the tales were suitable for children because of scenes of violence and sexuality. He worked to modify plots for many stories. For example, Rapunzel, in the first edition of Kinder- und Hausmärchen, clearly shows a sexual relationship between the prince and the girl in the tower, which he edited out in subsequent editions. Tarter writes that morals were added. In the second edition, A King's Regret was added to the scene in which his wife is to be burned at the stake, and often the characters in the tale were amended to appear more German. Every fairy, Vieh, prince, Prinz, and princess, Prinzessin, all words of French origin, was transformed into a more Teutonic-sounding enchantress, Zauberin, or wise woman, Weise Frau, King's son, Königssohn, King's daughter, Königstochter, Little Red Cap, the Golden Goose, Bearskin, Cinderella, Faithful John, The Water of Life, Thumbling, Briar Rose, The Six Swans, Rapunzel, Mother Holle, The Frog Prince, The Travels of Tom Thumb, Snow White and Red Rose, The Three Little Men in the Wood, Rumpelstiltskin, Little One Eye, Two Eyes, and Three Eyes. Grimm's Fairy Stories by Jacob Grimm and Wilhelm Grimm. Illustrated by John B. Gruella and R. Emmett Owen, 1922. Contents: The Goose Girl, The Little Brother and Sister, Hansel and Gretel, Oh, If I Could But Shiver, Dummling and the Three Feathers, Little Snow White, Catherine and Frederick, The valiant little tailor